Last November, I reviewed the ASUS VG279Q, excited by the promise of its LNB Sync feature, adaptive sync and backlight strobing at the same time, something that's still exclusive to ASUS. Unfortunately, in that monitor, LNB Sync came out half-baked, and in my review I called it useless. The VG279Q was otherwise totally okay, and I'm still using it as my primary display. I'm even using it to put together this review of ASUS's new $400 VG279QM, a 27-inch 280Hz Full HD IPS display, complete with the newest and hottest version of LNB Sync. So how baked is LNB Sync this time? Well, we'll get to that. The VG279QM is using a new super-fast IPS panel from AU Optronics, and ASUS pushes the refresh rate a little beyond its competitors to 280Hz, which is a nice bonus for us Quake Live players. This is done through an OSD overclock, but I'll just consider this the default. Does that extra 40Hz make a difference? For sample and hold displays, more is always better. And as a little tease for the rest of this review, the VG279QM performs astonishingly well over its full and very broad adaptive sync range. And it is an adaptive sync or FreeSync monitor, even though G-Sync branding is everywhere. There's a G-Sync sticker on the base, and the screen even pops up with the G-Sync logo when you first turn it on. The VG279Q, another G-Sync compatible screen, used the phrase compatible on its startup logo. Very odd. Let's start quickly with the monitor's physical design, because not much has changed since the VG279Q. When looking at the two side by side, it's clear that ASUS has really consolidated these tough series monitors and standardized their appearance so much so that I'm having trouble telling which is which. The stands are identical, offering the same height, rotation, and tilt adjustments. I still wish the screen could go a little higher though. The stand is fine for a monitor in this price class, but I'm still impressed a bit more by ViewSonic's XG series. Rear inputs include a power jack for the external power brick, 2 HDMI ports, 1 display port, a headphone jack, and what I assume is a USB service port. OSD navigation is done identically to the VG279Q, with a clickable directional joystick, and smartly, ASUS puts what will be your most used options on the very first screen: Overdrive, Adaptive Sync, and LNB Sync. For calibration, ASUS doesn't give us much to work with. The screen ships in something called Racing Mode, which is the correct choice for the default. The other game visual options aren't any good, mostly because their gamma curves are totally crazy. Like with the VG279Q, we get no option to actually adjust gamma, so we're stuck with what ASUS provides in Racing Mode. The only real option we have to play with is the color temperature setting, and what you see on the screen right now are the settings I used for my calibration and all subsequent tests. Speaking of those tests, let's get right into it. The VG279QM can get very bright, a full 420 nits, but as I complained about in the VG279Q review, even at an OSD brightness setting of 0, you're still at 106 nits. That may not matter to some of you who prefer a nice bright display, but you'd be surprised by the amount of people who want the screen to get much darker for nighttime viewing. But contrast is great. Well, at least great for an IPS panel. The VG279QM maintains a contrast ratio of about 1050 to 1 throughout the OSD brightness range. The ViewSonic XG270QG, which uses the same LG Nano IPS panel as in the 27GL850, impressed me with its response times, but that came at a contrast ratio penalty. For that screen, I measured a contrast ratio of only 700 to 1. This AU Optronics panel does better in response times while maintaining this 1050 to 1 ratio. Good stuff here. For gamma, I prefer to calibrate to BT1886, which is the white reference line you're seeing in these charts, but ASUS targets a gamma of 2.2. There's really no correct gamma, which is why I don't have any numerical results here. What you prefer depends on your ambient lighting conditions. For instance, in a bright room, having a gamma that's too high means you can't see any dark details. ASUS, just give us options, please. Straight out of the box, ASUS's Racing Mode tracks grayscale pretty well, with a delta E average of only 0.9. This mode uses the warm color temperature, which leaves the image a bit too red, but it's impressive for a default configuration. I praised ASUS for the VG279Q's default setup, and I'll do the same thing here for the VG279QM. Good job, ASUS. The dramatic rise in blue at the low end is typical, and you'll see that in the upcoming uniformity shots. The VG279QM is a standard gamut panel, and its gamut triangle shows undercoverage in the red primary, but overcoverage in both the green and especially in the blue. ASUS gives us no calibration options here, so the initial out-of-box 3.6 delta E average is essentially unchanged with my slight OSD tweaks. You may have caught a glimpse of an sRGB mode in the OSD earlier, but it does nothing to clamp the primaries to the sRGB color space. This is another area where ASUS needs to improve. The VG279QM's product page advertises FlickerFree technology, so I may as well test it. This animation shows my photodiode responses of a full white screen while I drop the screen brightness with the OSD. The screen here was refreshing at 280 Hz, and you can spot little brightness peaks every 3.6 milliseconds, but these are so small they're unnoticeable. My last review was of the Acer KG271U, and I spent a lot of time complaining about its anti-glare coating. Luckily, the VG279QM's coating is quite mild. It's much less coarse than all three TN panels I've tested, so there's no rainbow speckling or graininess. Here's a comparison of all the screens I've tested so far. The TN panels have terrible AG coatings, but the VG279QM looks fantastic even for a 27-inch Full HD panel. I was a bit worried about that. At only 82 pixels per inch, 27-inch Full HD screens are never going to look amazing at typical desktop distances, but it's especially apparent after using the VG279QM's sibling with a QHD screen, the VG27AQ. At the same size, 109 ppi makes a huge difference, and because of what we'll see later for its response time measurements, I want this panel in a higher resolution. To test for banding, I take an actual photograph of the screen displaying these 256 color gradient patches, but no screen so far has had any trouble with this. If you're seeing banding on your monitor, it's most likely the content rather than the screen. Now let's take a look at uniformity. At full white and 50%, which is RGB 128, the VG279QM exhibits slight darkening in the two bottom corners, and the middle of the screen is slightly hot, but this is only really apparent in the exaggerated shots, which have the contrast cranked and are all exposed to middle gray. I think the VG27AQ is slightly better here. But as I scroll down to the 5% in black shots, the VG279QM is incredible. I think in all my previous reviews, I've complained about backlight bleed and uniformity issues, but here, the VG279QM performs exceptionally. I purchased this monitor, so this is not a result of a cherry-picked review sample. Of course, I could have just gotten lucky with the panel lottery, but I'm still shocked by how good this is. Let's take a closer look at the exaggerated black shot, and I'll throw up a comparison with some of the other monitors I've tested. My VG27AQ is okay-ish, with a little bleed along the bottom edge. The ViewSonic, though, was a huge backlight bleed disaster. The VG279QM is so good. Viewing angle performance is impressive, which shouldn't be a shock given that the VG279QM is an IPS panel. The screen doesn't darken dramatically until about 40 degrees off axis, and there are no large gamma or color shifts as the screen rotates. But it is susceptible to IPS glow, and you can see that in the black screen animation. Alright, now we're on to the fun stuff. This is where I get to pull out my photodiode and start going nuts with measurements. And we start with the input lag. These waterfall charts I show for input lag are just uniform distributions of responses where the screen is falling from white to black, and I'm only looking for the very best response. I caught one response at only 1.97 milliseconds for the VG279QM, which is only 0.39 milliseconds slower than my CRT. If you're wondering how that compares with the other screens I've tested, we can go back over to the charts section on ApertureGrill.com. Down to the bottom of the page, you can see that there's not much difference amongst these. They're all fantastic. The lag you feel in games, though, can be much higher. And for more information on that, check out my input lag video. One weird and annoying wrinkle, though, is the lag when the VG279QM is set to a fixed 60 Hz. Using the same technique that I used to find the adaptive sync lag, I measured the 60 Hz lag to be more than 34 milliseconds. Even moving the cursor around on the desktop felt terrible. This may be a problem for those of you who intend to hook this up to a console. Before we get into pixel response times and cumulative absolute deviation, we need to start with the VG279QM's overdrive modes. Like most non-G-Sync monitors, the ASUS unfortunately doesn't have just one best overdrive setting that can be used throughout the refresh rate range. For previous models, ASUS used the nomenclature trace-free, but now they've thankfully just called them overdrive modes. In the OSD, you can select from 6 options: 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100. The out-of-box default is 60. Overdrive 100 causes pixels to massively overshoot their target level and is useless. Including modes like this must be a marketing-driven decision, because they're obviously not for the benefit of the end user. The real overdrive competition is between 20, 60, and 80. Before I give you my recommendation, take a look at some pursuit photos of my custom Unreal Engine build called Frog Pursuit. Why I'm showing you a bunch of blurry, multicolored frogs will need a bit of an explanation though. For us monitor reviewers, the industry standard, if you will, for pursuit shots is to use Blurbuster's testufo.com. But because TestUFO runs in a browser window, it can't accurately depict true adaptive sync behavior. I go into much more detail about this in my Acer KG271U review at around the 7-minute mark. I'll put a link if you want to watch that, and I do recommend watching it. But Frog Pursuit acts as a full-screen game, so I can take true-to-life pursuit shots at any particular refresh rate, and that's crucial for testing a monitor that can go all the way out to 280 Hz. If you want to try it for yourself, there's a download link on Aperture Grill. It's not a virus, I promise. Let's start by looking at 280 Hz first. On the website, you can click around to swap between the images, and at first glance, I'm not seeing much difference between OD 20, 60, or 80. But look closely at the red frog's eyes and stripes. I think OD 80 is the winner here. As the refresh rate drops to 144 Hz, OD 80 is starting to develop obvious overshoot halos. Check out the RGB traffic lights at the top. You can see cyan, magenta, and yellow ghost images behind the RGB circles. But OD 80 does show some detail that the others are missing. Look at the color transition on the globes. I'll leave it up to you to call the winner, and I'll show you why in a moment. At 85 Hz, OD 80 is much too strong, and even OD 60 is showing moderate inverse ghosting trails. OD 20 seems ideal here. To test these numerically, I use what I call cumulative absolute deviation, or CAD, which sums up the total area away from what a perfect LCD would do. This single metric penalizes slow response and overshoot in one little package, so it's my preferred method of comparing LCD behavior. The lower the CAD, the better. The chart on screen now shows the CAD scores for the 3 overdrive modes we've been looking at throughout the VG279QM's total adaptive sync range. Looking first at the pink line, OD 80 performs exceptionally well at high refresh rates. A CAD of 100 is truly fantastic. At both 280 Hz and 240 Hz, 3 overdrive modes fall nicely into place. 80 performs better than 60, which performs better than 20. But they start converging at around 144 Hz, where they all perform, CAD-wise, similarly. That's why I said previously it's up to you to pick the winner. I think OD 60, even with its slight inverse ghosting, is the best option here, but you may have a lower tolerance for overshoot artifacts than I have. Many FreeSync panels perform badly at around 85 Hz, and the VG279QM is no exception here. OD 20 outperforms both OD 60 and OD 80. If you're not chasing the absolute best performance, a good set it and forget it option is Overdrive 20. Look how remarkably consistent it is over the entire adaptive sync range. Very impressive. To get an idea of where these CAD scores are coming from, here's a comparison matrix of the actual photodiode response curves of the VG279QM, rising from RGB 63 to RGB 191 at 3 different refresh rates and the 3 overdrive modes. Don't be afraid, I'll walk us through this. Let's start with the bottom row first, Overdrive 80. At 85 Hz, that big lump on top of the target response is overshoot, and it causes the CAD to rise dramatically. Oh, and it looks bad too. As the refresh rate increases, meaning the frame times go down, the overdrive starts getting tamed faster, and the overshoot all but disappears at 280 Hz. Next, consider the middle column, 144 Hz. All the OD settings here share a roughly similar CAD, but they do so in very different ways. OD 20 takes the slow route to get to RGB 191. OD 60 and OD 80 get there faster but overshoot. Visually, I prefer OD 60 at 144 Hz, but that's a question of preference. And lastly, take a look at the first row, OD 20. If even a small amount of overshoot bothers you, OD 20 stays consistent over the entire adaptive sync range. It's slower than the other modes, but you can still get great performance and never have to touch the VG279QM's OSD. So for my recommendation, I'm okay with OD 80 for refresh rates above 160 Hz, but OD 60 works great as a compromise between speed and overshoot, and since that is the default mode of the VG279QM, all further testing was done at OD 60. We can now look at some Frog Pursuit images covering the whole refresh rate range of the monitor. At every refresh rate, the VG279QM is doing better than every other monitor I've tested so far. And for those of you who are unconvinced that 280 Hz is offering any benefit over 144 or 165 Hz, watch as I swap between these two images. The motion clarity of even a non-strobed 280 Hz is amazing. I'm not going to cover these response time charts in great detail here, but if you'd like to take a closer look at them, go to the text review on ApertureGrill.com, where you can see every CAD, real response, and first response for 8 different refresh rates spanning the adaptive sync range. A better way to get an idea of just how well the VG279QM is performing is to look back at the charts section, where the lead chart shows the average CAD for all the monitors I've tested so far. Let's take a closer look. Wow. The VG279QM is performing on par or better than my best performing monitor so far, the LG 24GM79G, which is a TN panel, and it does so out to 280 Hz. When I reviewed the ViewSonic XG270QG back in December with its LG Nano IPS panel, I was incredibly impressed by its response times, which clearly beat my VG27AQ. But the ViewSonic and the LG 27GL850, based on other reviews, paid the price with sub-TN contrast ratios. This VG279QM, with its AU Optronics panel, beats that LG panel handily and maintains a 1050:1 contrast ratio. So far, amazing performance, but I'm a big CRT guy, so I covet the motion clarity that only backlight strobing can provide. Before we look at LNB Sync though, let's look at the standard fixed refresh rate strobing mode, plain old LNB, first. The VG279QM can only strobe at 4 refresh rates, 120, 144, 240, and 280 Hz. ASUS maintains the same brightness for each refresh rate by using a fixed 30% duty cycle for the backlight. That leads to an impressively short 1.1 millisecond pulse when strobing at 280 Hz. Shorter pulse durations lead to less motion blur. For instance, the majority of a CRT's phosphor glow has decayed in only 0.5 milliseconds. One complaint a lot of people have with strobing modes is the reduction in brightness. The VG279QM can hit almost 200 nits during strobing, which is brighter than what I use for non-strobe modes, and it does this while taking no contrast ratio penalty. I wouldn't worry about this, or that, or that. Here we go. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that when enabling strobing on the VG279QM, ASUS blocks us from adjusting the overdrive setting. This happens in both LNB and LNB Sync modes, and it's a huge problem for this monitor. ASUS opts for what looks like OD80. That might be okay for strobing at higher refresh rates, but it makes 144 Hz and 120 Hz strobing unusable due to the massive and unnecessary overshoot. It also has implications for LNB Sync's usefulness, which I'll touch on later. But let's look at some Strobe Frogs. At 280 Hz, that 1.1 millisecond pulse duration is paying dividends. Compare it with the CRT shot. You can see the 1 pixel wide pupils on the frogs. There's still a significant amount of strobe crosstalk where we can see multiple copies of everything, but it's not terrible. 240 Hz is roughly similar, but look at the RGB traffic light for RGB 191. You can see the overshoot starting to creep in even at this high refresh rate. 200 plus Hz strobing may be a bit too much even for a fast LCD. So I was looking forward to using a lower refresh rate to allow the pixels more time to transition before the strobe. But without the ability to reduce the overdrive mode at 144 and 120 Hz to something more reasonable, these lower refresh rates are awash in incredibly distracting inverse ghosting. On the 120 Hz shot, don't worry about the grotesque-looking afterimages in between the frogs. LCDs subject to rapidly oscillating drive levels can develop temporary image retention, and any sort of panning test pattern can induce it. The high overdrive exacerbates this. It subsided in about 20 minutes. Please, ASUS, allow us to turn off the overdrive for strobing modes. Right now, only the 240 Hz and 280 Hz strobing modes are usable, and these two share the same problem that any other fixed refresh rate displays have. It's very hard to keep games at a smooth and consistent 240 plus frames per second. But perhaps that's where LNB Sync can come in and save us. As I mentioned earlier, I was rather harsh about ASUS's implementation of LNB Sync on the VG27AQ, calling it useless. But I wasn't just being grouchy. Getting a working version of backlight strobing plus adaptive sync is the monitor nerd's version of searching for the Holy Grail. ASUS tempted us with the Grail, but what we got instead was a used plastic solo cup with a hole in it. So, is LNB Sync 2.0 any better? Yes, but no. To start with something positive, ASUS's second go-around with LNB Sync is better than their first attempt. They fixed the out-of-sync strobing, so no more cyclically shifting images, but that shouldn't have shipped in a product anyway. We also now get a frame rate window, albeit a small window, where LNB Sync might have a clarity advantage over non-strobed operation. Looking at the high refresh rate shots, LNB Sync at 280Hz and 240Hz does show modest improvements in motion clarity compared to the non-strobed shots from earlier. That window extends down to about 200Hz, so to say something nice, that's an 80Hz wide window where we can get clean-ish motion and adaptive sync working simultaneously. But below 200Hz, everything starts falling apart. As with ELMB, ASUS doesn't allow us to adjust overdrive while ELMB Sync is active, so at lower refresh rates, inverse ghosting coupled with essentially no motion clarity improvement make ELMB Sync look terrible. Check out the 85Hz shot. If you're playing a game at around this frame rate, you'd be crazy to not just turn off ELMB Sync and use OD20. It'll look way better. It's not a good sign that in order to make the monitor perform best, we need to turn off one of its highlight features. But why isn't there any clarity benefit? Let's take a closer look at how ASUS is achieving their ELMB Sync. Just as I did for the first version of ELMB Sync on the VG279Q, I took photodiode measurements of the VG279QM over a broad range of refresh rates to see what ASUS is really doing. The yellow line in the animation shows the frame time for each refresh rate. The ELMB Sync pulses are finely timed appropriately, so that's a big improvement. But ASUS has implemented a devil's horns type strobe. For each frame, two 0.5 millisecond primary pulses bracket a high-frequency PWM backlight fill. Don't worry about the high frequency here. The average value of the fill is about 30% of the peak pulse brightness. This strategy partially works for high refresh rates because the effective duty cycle of the devil's horns pulse is low, giving us enough dark time to enhance motion clarity. But at lower refresh rates, the duty cycle is too high, and those two prominent peaks become quite visible. You can actually see the shape of the backlight waveform explicitly in pursuit shots. These four images show a single pixel wide white line panning across a gray background at different refresh rates. At 280 and 240 Hz, if you squint, you might be fooled into thinking you're seeing a single pulse, but the brighter outside primary pulses are actually pretty easy to spot. At 120 Hz, the devil's horn shape is clear, and given how long the pulse lasts, this shows too much horizontal blur to be useful. And check out the 60 Hz shot. The double strobe exactly matches the photodiode response. At these lower refresh rates, ELMB Sync is worse than not strobing at all. I'm honestly stumped why this is the road that ASUS is choosing to go down. Given the two generations of ELMB Sync technology I've seen, and the meager improvement we're getting with the second version, it may take years before ASUS can do ELMB Sync properly, but I have serious doubts they understand what they're attempting. I'll echo my conclusion from the VG279Q review. Don't purchase the VG279QM for its ELMB Sync feature. Alright, that's it for the measurements. And kind of like on my VG279Q review, I'm sorry to end on a sour note because, other than the strobing modes, the VG279QM is frankly amazing. It may seem a bit nuts to spend $400 on a full HD monitor in the year 2020, but playing games at 240 FPS really is a different experience than at 144. And until we get Big Navi or an RTX 3080 Ti, maintaining those sorts of frame rates at QHD and UHD resolutions is not currently in the cards. Of course, I'd rather not have to make this choice, so please ASUS, give me the same performance in a UHD package, and don't charge me $1,000 for it, and I'll be happy. If you're like me and still chasing that CRT high, this is not the monitor you're looking for. But for those of you looking for higher and higher frame rates, and you know who you are, the VG279QM is a fantastic choice. Thanks for watching.